Alright guys, we're back with the KX. We actually had to move that back there. We're on part 4 for this. First and foremost, I do want to apologize for not posting last Sunday. We ran into an error with our camera. Not the cameraman, the camera, which kind of delayed us, but we're back. For part 4, we're basically going to be going over what we did for the spring for the shift stopper. We are going to get the whole right side done over, the clutch on, and then we're going to do the top end. We already had the cylinder honed as we did last video. We got the power valve together, greased it all up, everything's operating perfectly. We're gonna put the piston on, we're gonna put the cylinder on, head on. But without further ado, we're gonna get into it. We had the issue where, not issue, but where I just didn't trust the spring. So what we did the gasket maker, and it is holding up perfectly. So now the only thing we have to do on the right side is install the clutch. And that's pretty straightforward. So without further ado, let's start that. Grab the clutch holding tool. Now with the impact, I just get it just to where it's a little bit, and then we get it to where it should be torqued. With that all set up, we got the outer and inner basket installed. Everything's torqued down to spec. We're gonna put the friction plates and pressure plates in, get it all screwed in with the springs, and we are good to go for the clutch. Now, if you're doing a clutch and it's brand new, you're gonna wanna let the plates soak in oil. Some people do it overnight, some people do it an hour, some people really just do it 15 minutes. It really doesn't matter as long as it soaks in oil just a little bit so the plates don't melt to each other or burn when you first start up. So for a clutch, it goes friction plate, then pressure plate, and it alternates. So we just put a pressure plate in, now we're back on a friction plate. Now if you do it right, you should have a friction plate on the outside. Now before you put this plate, the last pressure plate, you need to do the clutch push rod. That goes all the way through the main transmission shaft, all the way until you get to the clutch actuator arm. So this is actually the clutch actuator arm. When you pull that clutch lever in, this is what actually spins. What that does is this tab pushes the push rod out, which actually releases the pressure between the friction and the pressure plates. This is the clutch push rod, okay? So let's just simulate that this is pressed on here. When I pull the clutch in, it's pushing it out, and just like that. That's exactly what's happening when you're pushing your clutch in. And when that happens, it releases all pressure from the friction plates and the pressure plates. And then you put all the springs in, and then bolts. And right now you're just going to want to get it till snug. You're not going to torque these down just yet. You're just getting them where it's snug, just like that. Now that that's done, I grab my actual ratchet. And again, you can torque these down. You look into your specs. Just gonna give it a little quick turn. You'll feel when these are too tight. It'll get hard to hold the clutch while you're tightening that. After that threshold, you don't want to go too crazy. With that being said, our clutch is done. Everything's looking good, and I don't know if you can see this, Tyler. So that's the push rod. If I'm pushing in, it pushes out. Pulling up, it's creating space between the friction and the pressure plate, so it's not fully engaged. Right side is good. Everything's in. Everything's looking good. So now we're gonna get the side cover, the clutch inner clutch cover, and we're going to install the last few things on that. Get that pressed on, and then we're gonna move our way to the top end. First thing we're going to do is rebuild the water pump. The bearing we already removed, goes on this side, on the inner side, and then there's 2 seals. Probably seen this in our other videos. Nice little seal removal tool. Alright, this is going to be a little bit worse than I thought. The outer thing got stuck inside the inner hub. Well, this is going to be a fun one. Now what I'm going to try doing is, because you know you always run into issues sometimes, I'm going to try getting the inner one out first. Wow. Fingers of steel, man. Just poke the outer ace out. I think we could reuse this, honestly. This is a small seal. We'll just push this in by hand. It's about as much I can do with my thumb without giving myself arthritis. Okay, yeah, we're not doing that. Okay, so this seal is fully pressed in. Last but not least, we're gonna press the bearing in. There we go, we are metal on metal. There you go, you got a rebuilt water pump. Now what we're gonna do is basically just install power valve assembly on this inner clutch, and then we're gonna install the water pump shaft. So we're just gonna grease this shaft up just a little bit so we can prep it to put it in the casing. This is a small seal, so this we can just push in. And there you go, you got your seal pressed in. With that pressed in, so we are going to grease up the shaft, and we're just gonna gently just push it through, and there we go. Now these small 3mm Allen keys, you are going to throw some blue Loctite on there. Turn it a little bit. You don't want to go overboard with these. These are very easy to strip. Now one thing I did forget, we have one last bearing to go in. So now what we're going to want to do is basically install the power valve gear itself and make sure that everything is operating smoothly. This little groove right here, groove goes right in there. So everything's fitting well. The arm is sliding right into the power valve, that groove where it's supposed to fit. And everything's spinning nice and freely. So on any older Kawasaki's, on the KX250, it's a little bit different. They have a little small pin that goes right in this hole. You drop that in there, and there's a super small little Phillips head screw that you put in there to cap that in. Basically what that pin does is it's like a locking mechanism so this rod can't come out. Now what we're going to do is we're going to install the water pump shaft. Just going to lube the shaft just a little bit, and you're just going to slide that into the bearing. But it'll slide and then it clicks down, means you are all the way pressed in. Some water pump propellers, they have a groove, they have a little square notch. This one strictly just screws right onto it. We're just gonna go in until it gets tight. We're gonna keep this finger tight. It's gonna be easier to tighten once this gear is actually touching the rest of the motor because it'll have more leverage to hold this tight. That's about it for the right side. The last thing we're gonna do, so the kickstart seal on. Okay, there we go. Now that concludes the inner clutch cover. Obviously when you're placing gaskets, you want to make sure that the surface is clean before installing. Once the gasket's on, we're going to feed this on. Remember, kickstart's a pressure point, water pump, and power valve. So you're just going to slowly feed it on. There you go. And there we go. Your inner clutch cover is on. So we're going to get these bolts down. They're all torqued down at 7.5 foot-pounds. We're going to get that done, and then we're going to get the actual clutch cover on, water pump cover on, and then we're going to move to the top end. All the bolts on the Kawasaki are the exact same size, so you don't have to worry about misplacing bolts or anything like that. Then you're going to torque it down to spec or to feel. I've done a bunch of these bolts. I know exactly what 7 to 8 foot-pounds feels like. Now the inner clutch cover is on. We're going to do the clutch cover itself, and then with the water pump, and then we're done, finally, of the whole bottom end, and slap the top end together. Throw gasket on. We already have the dowel pins in place. Again, same thing. Grab your ratchet or your torque wrench. And we are good. Now we're going to move on to the water pump. Water pump, gasket. Again, make sure that the dowel pins are in. There you go. We're pressed in. Perfect. There are only 3 bolts for the water pump. So there you go. Our bottom end is finally complete. So that's the bottom end right there. We got it all together. Now what we're going to do is the top end. First things first, we're going to want to move over on this side and prep the piston. Any normal piston, the arrow is aiming at the exhaust of the engine. A lot of people think the arrow is aiming at the forward, the front of the engine. That is incorrect. First thing, before putting the rings on or anything, I put one C-clip in first. This just makes it a lot easier to install it because it's a little bit more tricky to get these in the piston when it's on the rod itself. With the snap ring, we are going to put on the opposite side of what we're working on. When you install them, you do not want them up and down. You want them horizontal. If they're up and down, the force can open or close the snap ring and it can pop off, and then you can grenade your whole motor. You're going to get one side pinched in, and on the other, you're going to be prying with the flathead, and you're going to be pushing down at the same time with your thumb. When you do that, it should snap right into place. So now we are going to move on to actually installing it into the crank itself. The wrist pin bearing. You're going to want to let this sit in oil. Slide that right into the connecting rod, just like so. Now the wrist pin itself, which actually slides into the wrist pin bearing, which holds the piston onto the connecting rod. Again, you don't need to go crazy with the oil or lube, whatever you use. What we're gonna do is grab the connecting rod, line up the holes just like that. Pistons on the connecting rod. So we're gonna get our new snap ring. You wanna put a rag or something in between the connecting rod and the cases to block off any holes. The snap ring can actually shoot out and go down into the bottom end. If that happens, all the work you did has to come back off so you can get this little piece out. Now what we're gonna wanna do before we actually think about putting a gasket on or anything else, we just wanna wipe off the oil. I always do the bottom ring first, and you're just gonna jump over that first top ring right there, and then you're gonna just slide it right there into the bottom ring, just like that. There's an opening in the ring, and you want it on that notch. So when it's compressed, see that? It's closing perfectly onto that notch. That's where it should be. So we're gonna get the second one on, and there you go. Now we have both rings installed. They're both positioned right on the notch. So what we're gonna do next is we're gonna throw the base gasket, cylinder gasket on, and then we're gonna drop the jug on. Before putting the base gasket on, one last pass. Okay, is all the oil off. So now with that in place, the last thing we have to do, lube the bottom of the cylinder and fit it on. So we're gonna go grab the cylinder right here. So we're just gonna take a little bit of oil. Okay, reed cage facing the back, exhaust facing forward of the engine. So what I'm gonna wanna do is make sure that the rings are in their notches. Drop it on. Okay, we got one ring on. There we go, bottom ring on. Once that's on, you're gonna slowly feed it on. Now before I put it in all the way, I actually want to make sure that this thing did not pop out. Push up with my thumb for the power valve. Now the dowel pins just need to shimmy into place. So there you go. Top end is installed. So what we're gonna wanna do right now is get the cylinder bolts on, and then we're gonna get the head on. We're not going crazy. We're just getting to where it's a little more snug, and you'll see as we tighten that down, the rest of the bolts will get a little loose. That's why you do cross pattern when you're doing this. Now we're just gonna make sure that everything is tight. There you go, okay. Wall torqued down. Now we're gonna put the head gasket on, put the head on. So we are going to put the head gasket on. It has a little EX here standing for exhaust. So that just sits right there. Now we got the head here, very simple. Just drop it on, just like that. Same thing with the head bolts as we did with the cylinder bolts. Hand tight first, then you get them snugged, then torque them down. We're just gonna get them just where they're a little snug. We are just gonna go in cross pattern until you hear the click. That means we are at 18 foot-pounds. There we go. That concludes the video for part 4. I appreciate you guys keep watching and stay tuned with this. We're going to be doing more videos like this for more builds. We're definitely going to be doing one for the CR500. So that concludes part 4 of the KX250 rebuild. Just to go over what we did, we finally finished the bottom end, which included doing the clutch, examining that shift stopper spring to make sure that was working well. We rebuilt the water pump. We installed the power valve on the bottom end, and then the water pump propeller itself, inner clutch, outer clutch cover, and then we actually put the piston onto the rod, jug onto the piston, head down, all torqued down. So this is the engine. Again, this thing looks absolutely beautiful. It's a 1994. It looks better than a lot of the 2020s that people bring into me. So again, that's the end of part 4. Thank you so much. Stay tuned for part 5, and we'll catch you next time.